Chapter 5. Harry was in his kitchen, books spread out on his kitchen table, taking notes from one of the maths books Hestia had given him. Sometimes, he got involved in other projects, cooking an elaborate dish, learning from Zoe or from Marty, but he still tried to get in some regular schooling every day. Sometimes he got Hestia to help him. Truth be told, ever since she had taught him the basics of reading, writing, and maths, he thought he had been doing pretty well learning by himself, at least, until he asked Hestia for help, and it showed where his interests were. Those subjects he liked, like science and history, he was very good at. Those he didn't, like mathematics, he wasn't so good at, so he tried to do his best to keep up on those subjects. So here he was, doing his sums and subtractions, and multiplications, and divisions. The fireplace in the living area whooshed, and Harry looked up, watching his all-time favorite goddess walk towards him. He got up from the table, smiling widely at her. "Hestia," he said, giving her a big hug. "Hello, Harry," the kind goddess greeted back, looking at the books and notes on the table. Her smile turned pleased. "Working on your maths?" Harry nodded. "It's boring, though. Sometimes we have to do things we don't like doing," the goddess of the home said, gently. "Think of it like doing the dishes." "I prefer doing dishes to doing maths," Harry pouted. Hestia laughed softly. "I think very few people would argue with you, Harry," she answered. The goddess started to sit down and looked around the kitchen as she did so. She froze halfway down, then stood up again. "Harry?" she asked, her voice deceptively soft. Harry froze. He didn't like that tone directed at him. "Yes, Hestia?" he asked, confused and concerned. "Why is there a bottle of amaretto on the kitchen counter, and why is it not full?" she asked, pointing to said bottle. "I do believe I explained that I preferred you did not drink." Harry smiled, and went to his refrigerator. "Because I've been cooking," he said, pulling the door to the appliance open. Hestia, at his shoulder, peered inside. On the bottom shelf stood half a dozen individually sized containers of tiramisu. "I made desserts," he finished, pointing to said containers. Hestia eyeballed them for a moment, then looked at him. "While that dessert does indeed often contain alcohol like rum or amaretto, it can be made without it," she stated. Harry took out a serving, and held it out. "It wouldn't be tiramisu without it," he protested softly. "Will you try one?" Hestia sighed softly, and accepted. "Do you know why I requested you do not drink?" he asked. Harry shrugged. "Because I'm too young?" he asked in return, placing obvious quotes. Hestia's lips twitched. "No, Harry, I'm from ancient Greece. All of us gods are. In our time, water was tainted, so alcohol was added to make it safe. Usually, 5 measures of water to 2 measures of alcohol, mostly wine." "No, Harry, the reason I asked you to stop drinking is because these days, alcohol is drank in a pure form. Drinking alcohol without diluting it leads to alcoholism. That is why I asked you not to drink." "Oh," Harry said, "so if I put it in water, it'd be okay?" Hestia sighed. "I would still prefer it if you didn't," she replied, conjuring a small spoon and trying some of the treats she was holding. Her eyes widened. She looked at the dessert. "Harry?" she asked, her voice low again. "Yes, Hestia," Harry replied, worried he'd done something wrong. "Did you add ambrosia to this?" she asked. Harry offered a tentative smile. "Just a pinch. I grated it really fine, until it's a powder, then sprinkled some in to enhance the flavor. It works brilliantly." Now that he thought about it, it had been several months since he first added ambrosia to the cookies he made for Zoe, and he never did get around to tell Hestia about his invention. Hestia ate some more tiramisu. "Yes," she said, "it does work well." She drew a breath, then released it. "2 things. First of all, I am extremely proud of you for figuring that out. Ambrosia is both an ingredient and a condiment, and can be used either way. I am very proud of you for figuring out the alternative use for it." "Thanks, Hestia," Harry said, smiling widely. The goddess in question went on. "Second, Please refrain from using it often. It isn't a problem for us gods, but as I explained before, there is only so much ambrosia a demigod can tolerate each day. It is the reason why most of the recipes I have given you do not include it. You may, inadvertently, go over the daily safe limit for a demigod, especially as you grow older, and may need ambrosia or nectar to heal. Ingesting additional ambrosia, even in small quantities, may trigger an adverse reaction. Oh, Harry said, suddenly feeling a lot less proud of himself. Don't worry, Harry, using ambrosia as a condiment isn't likely to trigger reactions, but the possibility exists. I simply ask that you be careful. She smiled at him, and as I said, I am extremely proud of you for figuring out that ambrosia is a seasoning as well as an ingredient. Harry just offered her a tiny smile. Now, back to liquor. Using it in cooking is fine. I simply wish for you to be careful with it. Alcohol did a lot of good back in the day, but it did a lot of bad, too. Like ambrosia. Now that I think about it, please be careful. The young boy relaxed. Thanks, Hestia. Now, you seem to have made more dessert than you can handle by yourself, the goddess teased. Are you cooking for someone else? Harry suddenly nodded enthusiastically. Artie and Miss Zoe love my cooking, so I sometimes bring them something when I go for training. I only brought cookies for Miss Zoe that first time, but Artie's pouting made me bring something for her, too. The next time I made something, Hestia burst out laughing. I could see my niece pout at not getting desserts, the goddess of the home said, still snickering. I would wager she wasn't very gracious about it, either. Harry shook his head. She guilted Miss Zoe into giving her some. That's why I started making things for both of them. Hestia smiled and patting his arm. I am glad to see that you get along with both of them, and that you have found the joys of cooking for others. Harry nodded again. I love it when they enjoy the things I make, he said. Hestia gave him a very pleased smile, when turned a little less sunny when she thought of something. Although I do think I will have a small chat with my niece and her lieutenant, just to make sure they're not taking advantage of you. Harry shook his head. I don't think they are. I love cooking and baking, and they love eating what I make. Hestia smiled softly, and patted his shoulder. I'll just make sure. Speaking of Zoe and Artie, Harry said, I probably won't be home for the next week or so. Hestia had finished her treat, and was now focused on the young boy. Are you going on a trip? She asked, her lips twitching into a teasing smile. I didn't think Artie or Zoe would go for a vacation with boys. Harry shook his head. Miss Zoe has said that she has taught me a lot in the last couple of months, and it's time for me to show that I was paying attention. So, she's taking me to a forest for a week, and I have to show her that I can survive. She'll be with me, but I'll need to pitch the tent, find water, make a fire, and find food all on my own. I'll have the standard pack used by Artie's hunters, so I'll have all the equipment I need, but I'll still need to find food and water and stuff. I see, Hestia replied, smiling gently. Thank you for letting me know. I would have been quite worried had I thought you disappeared. I'm sure you'll do well. Harry grinned. I must have that chat with Artie and her lieutenant first. However, Hestia said, standing up from the table, just making sure they know I am looking out for you. Of course. Harry just nodded, trotting after her as she walked calmly to the hearth. Please don't be angry with them, Hestia, he finally said. I just like brining desserts and stuff. They're not making me do anything, I promise. Hestia smiled, and patted his shoulder. You are kind, Harry, you don't have to worry. I just wanted to make sure. Good luck on your exam, she finished, and walked through the fire. Harry pouted after her. He didn't want to be reminded of the fact that his camping trip was an actual exam. He turned back to his books and studied for a few more hours, before he went to pack his bag. It didn't contain much, as he'd be getting an actual hunter's backpack with equipment. He only packed some of his school books, to keep making Hestia proud, and some toiletries. He started to walk to the hearth, then suddenly remembered the tiramisu he'd made. Taking 2 individual portions from his refrigerator, He carried them through the fire to the hunters' camp. As usual, when he arrived through the fire, he found the hunters startling, and more than a few bows were put away when they realized it was him. Except for Phoebe, she kept her bow out for a bit longer, just to make sure he had seen it. He wondered when she would stop hating him that much, before ignoring her behavior, and approaching Artie and Zoe, who were standing not far away, apparently engrossed in a discussion. Zoe was the first to notice him, and the conversation stopped immediately. He smiled widely at him, and gave his second favorite goddess a one-armed hug. "Hi Artie, hi Miss Zoe," he greeted them both. Before holding out the small containers, "I brought dessert." "Oh, and Hestia seems to think that you're making me cook. I don't know why." Artemis, goddess of the hunt, immortal man-hater, hugged him back and eagerly took the trop container. "Hello, Harry," she greeted back, "and thank you." Zoe simply greeted him with a dignified nod, and accepted her portion. "Lady Hestia visited earlier. We reassured her." Harry pouted. "I asked her not to be angry, and told her I love cooking and baking. She's merely looking out for three," Zoe reassured him. Tea was but a minor issue. Harry put his pack down, and looked at Zoe, who was eagerly eating her dessert. "Hug?" he offered. The lieutenant of the hunters stopped eating, and eyed him. "Nay," she declined. She'd gotten used to him offering hugs over the couple of months that she had been training him, and now no longer glared at him. Artie seemed amused at the byplay. She, too, had gotten used to Harry's offers, and once she realized that the boy really wouldn't act without Zoe's approval, has become amused rather than angry. "Art thou ready for thy test?" Zoe asked Harry, ignoring her lady's amusement with ease of long exposure. Harry nodded hesitantly. "I hope so, Miss Zoe. I have my notebook." "I'm sure Zoe won't let you die," Artie said, smiling. "Suffer, yes, but not die. Pain's a good teacher, after all." Harry pouted when Zoe laughed softly, which of course made her laugh harder. His pout turned into a small smile. Zoe didn't laugh all that often, and he liked it when she did. "Miss Zoe's great," he told Artie. "I'm sure that she'll help me if I need it. I'm sure it'll be great fun." The hunter shook her head slightly. "Tea is a test of thy ability. Tea wouldn't be much of one if I did it for thee. Thou must do this thyself, following what my lady and I have taught thee. I shall prevent thee from perishing, but I shall not aid thee unless absolutely necessary." Harry grinned. "All right, Miss Zoe, shall we depart?" she asked/told Harry. He just nodded. "My lady," Zoe said, dipping her head to her goddess in goodbye before handing her the empty container she still had in her hands. Harry grinned, hugged Artie, and said, "Bye, Artie." The goddess of the hunt hugged him back, patted his shoulder with her free hand, and walked away, shaking her head. Holding the stacked and empty containers, she'd make sure they were clean and sent back after all. She wanted Harry to cook more delicious desserts. There, Harry followed Zoe to the supplely tent, where he picked out one of the spare packs, and adjusted the straps with ease of long practice. Ever since Zoe had shown him that first time he went out with her, he'd been practicing it. Then came his first problem. He had a small pack with his schoolbooks and his own supplies, and the large hunter's pack with all the survival supplies, the tent, and so forth. He muttered, staring at the two packs and trying to find a way to put one in. The Zoe just stood there, amused, not offering any words or suggestions. Harry knew the hunter's pack itself was full. He'd repacked it often enough. Luckily for him, the pack also had lots of pockets that were left empty, to allow for carrying additional supplies. He squeezed the toiletries in the pockets, and shifted some of the smaller items around from one pocket to another so he had enough free space to put in his books. "Done," he said, grinning, proud of himself. Zoe just dipped her head, then said, "Art thou done stalling for time?" Harry pouted at her, knowing her well enough after months of lessons to know when she was teasing him. "Let us be off, then," the hunter said, paying his pout not mind. She, too, had gotten used to him, and his pout no longer affected her. They left camp. Harry looked around, trying to figure out where the camp was located this time. As they started walking, the boy frowned, and looked over his shoulder. The camp had seemingly vanished. He looked at the back of Zoe Nightshade, trying to figure out if she had something to do with this, when he suddenly realized they were in a forest, a mountainous forest. What? He managed, before stopping himself. Zoe answered him regardless, her voice amused. As part of the boon granted to us hunters by Our Lady, we are able to travel great distances quickly. It has its limits, as we must know exactly where we are going, but it has its uses. Oh. Okay, Harry said, looking at the forest that was now thick and dark around him. So, where are we? He asked innocently. Zoe laughed. Tea was a good try, but this is a test. Harry grinned. You can't blame me for trying. Indeed not, Zoe replied, still amused. Suddenly, the forest gave way, and they were in a very large clearing, covered with knee-high greens of all shapes and sizes. This is where I stop guiding thee, she noted seriously. However, before I do so, here, she said, holding out a hunting knife in a sheath, attach this to thy belt. Harry smiled widely. Thanks, Miss Zoe, he said loudly, accepting the knife. He knew better than to be without a belt. Even if he didn't need one, a belt was useful for a lot of things. He attached the sheath quickly and easily. Zoe gave a sharp nod when he finished. Consider this me abandoning thee. From here on out, tea is up to thee to survive. Harry looked around. Okay, he muttered, suddenly feeling a lot less confident about his chances. He had hoped to be dropped in a forest he knew, or one he had been to before. This was definitely a new forest, especially as the mountains were not familiar to him. He dropped the pack he was carrying, and dug the compass out of one of the pockets. He oriented it, then sighed, and put it away. Knowing which way was north wouldn't help him in this situation. He was lost, and this was a test of survival, not one of him finding civilization. First priority, find water. He looked around, then closed his eyes. He didn't hear the trickling of water. He opened his eyes again. The sky was overcast, low and dark and ominous, and Harry frowned up at it. If it started raining, he'd be in even more trouble. He identified a spot that he thought looking like it was downhill, and started walking. For close to an hour, he walked through the thick forest, the ground uneven. The overcast sky suddenly let loose with thunder and lightning, and copious amount of rain. Harry bit back a curse as the cold and wet hit him. Hestia didn't like bad language, and she was the last person Harry wanted to offend, so he bit back on his language, found a halfway decent spot, and hurriedly pitched his tent. Zoe, his ever-present shadow, was dressed warmly in thick winter clothing with a hood thrown over her head to stave off the rain. He wished he had similar equipment. Her tent was up before his was, and he shot her a look. She merely grinned at her self-pitching tent. Harry tried dragging some twigs and branches together to start a fire. The fire started, thanks to his Hestia-taught skills, but it sputtered out immediately thanks to the torrential rain. Harry guessed Mustard's use was definitely taking his anger out on him right now. He crawled into his tent, and spread out his sleeping bag. Without a fire, the tent was damp and cold, but the sleeping bag kept him off the freezing ground. He crawled into it after shedding most of his cold and wet clothing. He shivered, despite the heavy insulation of both tent and sleeping bag. His head was hurting slightly, his mouth was dry, he was dehydrated, not having drank anything for quite a while and having exerted himself quite badly. He listened to the downpour, and debated whether it would be worth it to capture any of the rain. The best he had was his canteen or his cup, which wouldn't capture anything in any sort of time scale where it would be useful. So he tried to sleep. He managed some half asleep dreaming, where his body was in a constant state of readiness. By the time he crawled out of his tent the next morning, he felt like he may as well not have slept at all. Luckily, the thunderstorm had passed. He reignited the firewood he had dragged together the evening before, and crawled next to it to warm up. Zoe, as if smelling he was up, came out of her tent and collapsed it back into a pack of gum. "'Tis extraordinary how good thou art at making fire," she commented, sitting down on the other side of it. Hestia taught me to make fire, Harry commented. If there's anyone good at making fire, it's the goddess of the hearth. Zoe dipped her head, acknowledging his comment. When the worst of the cold had leached out of his bones, Harry sighed, and started breaking down his tent and repacking his bag. When he had done so, he stopped the fire with a wave of his hand. He sighed, looked around, and started walking in what he thought was downhill. The slope was gentle, so gentle that he hardly recognized it. After a bit of walking, he reached a small clearing. In it was something that made him smile. Blueberries. There weren't a lot of them, as birds like them too. He found maybe 2 hands full. But it was better than nothing, and they made a decent breakfast. Keeping on his course, he suddenly heard the trickling of water. Grinning, he increased his pace, finding a small stream trickling down. Grinning widely, he knelt down. For a moment, he debated on boiling the water, before reaching down and drinking. He was just so thirsty. The first water in 24 hours felt so good going down that he drank deeply and greedily. After drinking his fill, he trekked back just a few minutes, making sure that he was high enough not to be inundated in case of floods. After pitching his tent, he decided that he wasn't going to be without a fire if the weather acted up again, so he started making a sort of roof to keep his fire under. He had to make sure it was high enough so it wouldn't catch on fire itself, and it took his several hours to finish. When Harry finished his task, he stepped back and looked at his construction. His stomach growled. He was hungry. He'd only eaten a couple of hands of blueberries, nowhere near enough. However, he was used to being hungry, and right now, he needed to gather firewood. Having done so, and starting his fire, he realized that the sun was already setting. It was going to be dark in an hour or so. He sighed, searched for, and found, some spruce trees, and gathered 2 handfuls of spruce needles. Filling his canteen at the stream, he used it to make himself a cup of spruce needle tea. He was still hungry, but at least the needle tea would give him some nutrients. It tasted really good, too, like how a Christmas tree smelled. When the sun set, Harry stoked up the fire to heat up his tent. Leaving one side open to the fire, he went to sleep. That night, he slept like a log. Despite his hunger, he woke up the next morning still hungry, and shivering. The fire had run out of fuel during the night and he hadn't had the energy to gather more, and so, he gathered more firewood. He could do without food for a while longer, but he needed fire to keep himself warm. The mountains were freezing cold at night. As he gathered firewood, he had drifted back to the clearing he had crossed on his way down. His eyes fell on something, and Harry smiled faintly. He'd reached the stage where his body had gone into a hyper-alert state in an effort to assist him in finding food. Slowly, he dropped the firewood he was carrying, and approached his prey. His hand snatched out. The butterfly had no chance and disappeared in his mouth before it realized what had happened. It wasn't much, but every bit of protein helped. He picked up the firewood again, and started collecting more. As he drifted along the sides of the clearing, he noticed some of the plants growing there. Curly Dock, it was edible, as long as the leaves and stems were young. The root had medicinal purposes, but you couldn't eat too much of it or you'd get stomach cramps. Picking the plants, and digging up the roots, Harry proceeded to take them back to his campsite. Heavily laden with wood and plants, Harry stumbled back into his campsite, and he immediately set to stoking a fire. Baking the dock roots, he ate some of the dock leaves and stems. They tasted bitter. He didn't like them much. The baked dock roots tasted even worse, and if he hadn't known for sure they were edible, he never would have eaten them. But he was so hungry, and used to eating whatever was available, so Harry didn't complain and just ate. With his stomach full of dock roots, he sat back to enjoy the fire and his surroundings. Now that he was warm, and not hungry, he had time to enjoy the beauty of the forest. Suddenly, his stomach cramped. He raced to the latrine pit. The diarrhea attack was not fun, and it left him feeling weak and dizzy. He wobbled his way back to camp. Zoe eyed him, yet said nothing. Too much dock root, I suppose, Harry told her. She remained quiet, but he was aware that her gaze was locked tightly on him. It wasn't reassuring. 10 minutes later, the attack came again. When he got back, he managed to make some pine needle tea, and sip from it. He felt incredibly ill now, and part of him wished he could call this off. He looked at Zoe. She looked compassionate. He wanted to give up. He wanted to go back to the temple. He wanted his bed. He wanted Hestia. He sighed, feeling his intestines crawl into a knot. He raced back to the latrine pit. When he got back, Harry grumped to himself. There was no way he was going to give up. No stupid dock route would keep him down. He crawled into his tent and slept. It was feverish, filled with nightmarish dreams, and when he got up, his stomach was burbling angrily. No more dock routes, ever. He pitched out the couple he had left. Eating them would be worse than not eating them. He had to find food, real food. As he foraged for food, he found something that made his blood run cold. Bear scat, fresh bear scat, wherever he was. There were bears. He looked at Zoe, as if to confirm what he had found out. She remained impassive, but something in her eyes told him that yes, he had identified the droppings correctly. He was still feeling ill from the stupid dock routes, but he had to stay sharp. He drew a breath, and tried to banish the feeling of illness. It didn't work, of course, but it was better than nothing. Suddenly, he spotted a deer across a clearing. He sighed. Hunting was out. Arctic kept the bow she gave him when they trained, and there was no way he'd be able to build his own and get good enough with it to do anything useful. That meant trapping. He scouted around, and found a trail. There didn't appear to be any other humans around, so the trail was definitely made by large animals. Finding a spot where the trail seemed to narrow, Harry looked around for useful items. Using some string from his pack, he constructed a large animal spring trap, connected to a pressure plate that was hidden by twigs and leaves. An animal would step on the plate, and a nearby sapling spruce would spring up, yanking the animal's leg and trapping it. He studied his trap for a few moments, trying to make sure it was well hidden, before the gurgle of his stomach reminded him of his hunger. He had to eat now. He couldn't wait for the trap to trigger and catch something. He retreated back to one of the clearings he had found. The sun was out, and the warmth felt good on him. For a moment, he stopped, drew himself to his full, not very impressive height, and basked in the warmth. Then his current mission reminded him. He shot the sun a smile, and went looking for something to eat. Stupid grasshoppers, he muttered when he saw one jump from one plant to the next. He blinked. Grasshoppers? He couldn't be picky. That lesson had been drilled into him from an early age, and grasshoppers were definitely edible. Half an hour later, he had caught maybe 12 of them, and skewered them on a long twig he had found. He roasted them over the fire, and ate them with gusto. They tasted delicious, and with their hard shells, they crunched like potato chips. He made himself a cup of nettle tea to go with his meal, sat back, and relaxed. He'd finally had something to eat, and had some time to relax. He felt better. The dock route had finally run its course, apparently. The next morning, he got up feeling as if he had been reborn. Drawing a deep breath to fill his lung with clean air from the mountainous forest, Harry smiled. So far, survival had been a whole lot tougher, and a whole lot harder, than he had imagined, but now he finally started to feel like he had a chance, like he was starting to get a grip on things. He grinned. Time to take a bath. After 5 days, he definitely needed it. Walking down to the creek, he turned to look at Zoe. "I'm going to have a bath and wash up." The hunter blinked, dipped her head, and ghosted into the forest. For a few moments, Harry stared in the direction she had vanished, suspicious that she was watching from a location he could see. Finally, he shrugged. There wasn't anything he could do about it if she did. He undressed, jumped into the cold water, and washed the grime of 5 days of living in the woods off of his skin. Dragging his clothes through the water, he did his best to get the grime off them as well. He hung them out to dry before splashing back in the stream. For just a little time, he was going to forget he was on a survival test, and he was going to enjoy himself. Zoe had explained how it was important to keep your spirits up when in a survival situation. So that was what he was going to do. Half an hour later, shivering and wrinkled, Harry shimmied back into his still damp clothing. At least they weren't completely wet anymore. He walked back to camp, and sat close to the fire to dry out. While he was doing that, he had taken a large branch, chopped a chunk off of it, and was now whittling a point to one end in an effort to make a spear. He didn't know why. The feeling in his gut was that he would need it. Since that feeling had also brought him to Hestia on Mount Olympus, he had stopped doubting it. "Thou seems cleaner," Zoe noted as she sat down on the other side of the fire, watching him whittle his spear. He grinned at her. "When I'm done here, I'm going to check the trap just in case you wanted to have a Washington." The hunter looked amused. "We hunters have our secrets," she said mysteriously. "Or, that's so unfair, self-pitching tents, now, mysterious ways to wash without washing," he complained playfully. Zoe was definitely amused now. "Thou knowest the price. Allow my lady to turn thee female, and thou canst learn these secrets for thyself." Harry finished whittling and studied the tip. He nodded, and held it in the fire to harden the wood. Keeping his eyes on his task, he said, "Only if I get to turn back if I change my mind." Zoe remained silent as he worked. Finally, she said, "Unfortunate, thou would make an excellent addition to the hunters. Thou wouldst be my little sister, then." Harry finished his spear, and shook his head. "You're my friend now, Miss Zoe." He looked at her, only to see that she had vanished. He sighed. It had been the longest conversation he had with her since this test started. Maybe she had been feeling lonely. He knew he was. Taking his new spear, he started trekking towards the trap. He had low expectations, despite the feeling in his gut. Traps rarely worked out so quickly. To his surprise, when he approached it, he heard squealing and snorting. He knelt down and looked through the bushes. His trap had caught a boar, a younger one, so to see. It definitely wasn't 80 centimeters tall, nor did it weigh 100 kilos. It still looked angry, squealing and snorting as it yanked angrily at the cordage tying it to the sapling. Harry was glad he had picked a sturdy-looking sapling for his trap, as that boar definitely looked like it could pull the tree out if it got angry enough. Harry approached cautiously. The boar turned on 3 legs, one of them still off the ground, held by the tree, and snorted at him.